This Feeling by LeilahMoon, read by Ella Max Mabella. Chapter 24. Hermione had been lying on her bed in the sixth-year girls' dormitory, running the conversation with Draco over and over in her head. She was hurt, angry, and scared, but so was he. Making the decision to go back to him, he'd suddenly emanated from her ring, but no words appeared. Panic coursed through her body as she raced from the common room, running down corridors and up staircases. Draco wasn't in the room of hidden things. Without quite knowing why, she turned and headed towards the hospital wing. Quietly, pushing the doors open, she saw a tall figure stride towards her. "I wondered whether I would be seeing you here this evening, Miss Granger."
"Professor Snape," she said, swallowing. "Where is he?"
Indicating to the furthest bed in the hospital wing, the potion master asked quietly,
"How much has he told you?"
"Very little. He won't let me help."
"As I expected,"
Snape said, nodding. Hermione was certain that she saw sadness flash across his features.
"Do be careful, Miss Granger. We cannot have a repeat of the last time I found the two of you in here."
Ducking her head, she walked quickly over to the bed Draco was currently occupying.
"Muffliato,"
she whispered, aware that one was sleeping just a few beds down. Hermione ran her fingers carefully across his forehead, brushing his fine hair back into place. She could see that his injuries were extensive. There was a strong smell of dittany in the air, and bandages covered his torso and arms.
"Draco, Draco."
She repeated his name over and over like a prayer.
"I'm so sorry. I was coming back for you. I shouldn't have left."
A small sob left her mouth.
"You needed me, and I left."
He trembled, and his eyes shut open.
"What? Where?"
He reached out, then winced in pain.
"Hey, it's just me. Don't move too much."
Hermione summoned a nearby chair and pulled it close to the side of the bed.
"What happened, Draco?"
Knowing the painful position it would put her in, he shook his head. They could talk about it later.
"Soon.
I'll tell you," he croaked. "I'm sorry for pushing you out for everything. I'm just so scared. I'm so fucking scared all the time."
"Will you tell me what you're doing?"
she asked hesitantly. His eyes fluttered shut, and for a moment she wondered whether he had fallen asleep.
"I'm trying to mend something for for him."
"Why? What is it?"
"It's just a cabinet, and I don't know why."
He said one truth for one lie. Hermione nodded slowly, deciding not to push him farther. He leaned his forehead against hers, wishing the pain wasn't stopping him from wrapping his arms around her.
"You're everything to me, Hermione. I don't exist without you."
"You'll never have to. We're always going to have each other, Draco."
Thanks to Snape's counter-curse, he recovered relatively quickly. It was only a few days before he was able to leave the hospital wing. When Hermione found out it was Harry who had cursed Draco with the unknown Sectum Sempra spell, she was beyond furious. It was a particular challenge trying to suppress this to an acceptable level of annoyance in front of her Gryffindor friends. Although Draco's schedule in the Room of Requirement had recently intensified, he was happy to help relieve her frustrations. It was a few weeks later when Hermione's ring warmed her finger and she saw a message flash up. Library, 6 p.m. After dinner that evening, she went directly to their quiet corner of the library. Draco was murmuring incantations under his breath and smiled proudly when he saw her.
"Protective enchantments," he explained, "so no one will stumble upon us."
"Very clever," she laughed. "Why are we here rather than in the Room of Requirement?"
His wand hand faltered almost imperceptibly.
"Oh, I just needed a change of scene."
She nodded and glanced around the space in surprise. He had been impossibly sweet. There was a large picnic blanket placed in the middle of the book-lined corridor, and fairy lights scattered amongst the shelves. With another flick of his wand, Draco summoned a variety of food from the school kitchens.
"Don't worry," he said. "I offered compensation to all house elves involved."
Hermione laughed.
"I love you."
His smile widened, and her heart leapt at the sight. They sat together, ate the perfectly prepared food, and talked about normal things. It felt freeing. All the topics of death and disaster were forbidden topics of conversation. When they had finished the meal, he tilted her chin to his and claimed her mouth, his tongue sliding agonizingly slowly against hers. Draco maneuvered them until he pinned her to the floor, his chest pressing into hers, and their kisses became increasingly desperate. Nipping and licking down her neck, he slipped a hand under her shirt, inhaling sharply when he realized she wasn't wearing a bra. Rolling her breasts beneath his large hand, she arched back in pleasure. He interspersed massaging them with gently flicking her pebbled nipples. Draco sucked her collarbone, leaving marks along her skin. Hermione's breathing faltered as she ground her hips against his, the friction from the remaining clothes making his erection almost painful. She reached down to grasp his hard length as he pushed his trousers off. Their kiss became rougher and more desperate as she stroked him slowly. A guttural groan tore from Draco's chest. She pumped him in her fist and tightened her grip, brushing her thumb over the head of his cock. "Hermione!" He breathed, his head falling against her chest. As he continued, he pushed his hand under her skirt and into her knickers, cupping the heat between her thighs. He slid a finger between her slick folds, and she trembled as his thumb rubbed her clit in light circles. Draco watched her closely as he added a second finger and pushed them deep inside of her. She let out a cry of pleasure, her body tingling with warmth as he curled them against her front walls. "Oh my God, Draco!" she moaned. They both watched their hands, one pumping up and down, the other in and out. Hermione murmured, Can I try something?" He nodded, swallowing as she moved down his body, leaving a trail of hot kisses on his skin, and reached his aching cock. He almost forgot how to breathe as she brushed her tongue over the sensitive tip before taking him slowly into her mouth. "Fuck!" She moved gradually up and down, her tongue curling along the silken length. She looked up at him, eyes wide, and lowered herself until he brushed the back of her throat. He saw her body stiffened and arousal drip down her thigh, knowing she was causing his reaction. "I need to be inside you," he groaned loudly, pulling her up and gripping her hips tightly, repositioning them so she was beneath him. Draco pushed her thighs apart with his knee and guided himself to her core. Clenching his jaw, he watched himself enter her and rocked slowly forwards. "You are mine," Draco growled as he thrust faster. Hermione gasped, her hips bucking against him, pleasure building within her body. "I'm yours." "Mine," he repeated firmly, rubbing her clit with his thumb. Her mouth opened in a silent scream as heat pooled in her abdomen. Draco pumped further into her as she clenched around him. Her body shook and toes curled, muscles jerking with each aftershock. He groaned as her walls squeezed tightly, his thrusts becoming frantic, and he spilled into her. Trembling in the aftermath of his release, Draco collapsed onto Hermione's chest and held her close. Neither moved for a long while. "Mine, mine," he murmured over and over into her skin. Her eyelids fluttered. "I'm yours, Draco. Always." "Whatever happens?" "Always," she repeated gently. Hermione woke abruptly in the dark library. Shivering, she reached over to pull Draco closer, but couldn't find him. Her heart pounded. Something felt wrong. Grasping blindly for her wand, she whispered, "Lumos." The space beside her was empty. Chapter 25. She leapt to her feet, looking frantically around the darkened room. Draco was nowhere to be seen. The only remnant of their evening together was the blanket they had slept on. Everything else had been removed. On shaky legs, Hermione ran to the doors of the library. She could hear shouting out in the hallway. "Hermione!" Ron screamed. "Hermione!" She raced towards him, and he grabbed hold of her shoulders. "Where have you been? Thank Godric you're safe." "Safe?" she choked. "What are you talking about?" Ron shook his head. "Not here," he said. "Come with me." As they entered the hospital wing, Ron caught her hand with his and gave a weak smile. Hermione had to hold back a gasp as she nodded in the direction of one of the beds. Bill lay propped up on pillows, and she could see a deep red gash sliced across his face. Before she could move towards him, she was enveloped in a crushing hug. Ginny held on to her tightly. "I've been so worried about you," she cried. "I'm really sorry, Gin. I didn't know," Hermione mumbled. "What's happened?" Ginny stepped back and looked at the group that had formed around them. The entire Weasley family were present, as well as Lupin, Tonks, and Harry. "That's what we were just about to discuss," Harry said, giving her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. There were suddenly so many voices talking at once. Hermione struggled to piece all of the information together. From what she could gather, Draco had left her in the library to allow Death Eater's entry into the castle through the cabinet he had been attempting to fix, the one in the Room of Requirements. A battle had ensued once the Order and the DA had been alerted to intruders. This gave Draco the opportunity to slip away and complete his task. Eventually, Harry's voice was the only one remaining. He said that he had heard fear in Draco's voice as he confronted Dumbledore, and maintained that he was lowering his wand before the other Death Eaters arrived. In the end, it was Snape who had killed their headmaster. Silence fell and Hermione's breath became shallow, like short, panting gasps. Her vision blurred and her fingers tingled. She felt as though her heart might burst from her chest as she sank slowly to the floor. All lessons were suspended, all examinations postponed. Some students were hurried away from Hogwarts by their parents over the next couple of days. Others refused point blank to leave without attending their headmaster's funeral. Hermione, Harry, Ron and Ginny were spending all of their time in each other's company. The beautiful weather seemed to mock them. Hermione could imagine how it would have been if Dumbledore had not died, if Draco hadn't abandoned her, and they had this time together at the very end of the year. The feeling of betrayal was one of the hardest to endure. It caused physical pain, as though her heart really had been broken in two. Hermione replayed their last night together over and over in her mind, desperately seeking understanding, an explanation for why he had left her alone to enact Voldemort's wishes. She ruminated constantly about the unknown. What could she have done differently? Were there questions that should have been asked? Conversations that should have been pushed? What if she had done what Draco asked her not to and confided in Dumbledore? Could she have prevented everything that had occurred? Guilt hung heavy in her stomach. Amongst the emotional upheaval, Hermione was also scared for Draco. Whilst the task was fulfilled, he was not the one to commit the unforgivable act. She could only assume that Snape had taken him back to the manor. Would he be punished or celebrated? In an attempt to escape the pain, Hermione threw herself into researching the Horcrux that Harry and Dumbledore had retrieved from the cave. As hard as she tried, and as many hours as she filled, she couldn't figure out what R.A.B. might stand for. It was a beautiful funeral. Hundreds of mourners arrived to pay their respects and honor the late Albus Dumbledore. Hermione's tears had flowed readily until her eyes burned, and she wasn't sure who or what she was crying for anymore. When she, Harry, and Ron finally had a moment alone, they were standing in the grounds looking up at the castle. "I can't bear the idea that we might never come back," she said softly. "How can Hogwarts close?"
"Maybe it won't," Ron mused. "We're not in any more danger here than we are at home, are we? Everywhere's the same now. I'll even say Hogwarts is safer. There are more wizards inside to defend the place. What do you reckon, Harry?"
"I'm not coming back, even if it does reopen." Ron gaped at him, but Hermione smiled sadly. "I knew you were going to say that, but then what will you do?" "I'm going back to the Dursleys once more because Dumbledore wanted me to," Harry replied. "It'll be a short visit, and then I'll be gone for good." "But where will you go if you don't come back to school?" "Then I've got to track down the rest of the Horcruxes, haven't I? That's why he told me about them. If Dumbledore was right, and I'm sure he was, there are still 4 of them out there. I've got to find them and destroy them, and then I've got to go after the 7th bit of Voldemort's soul, the bit that's still in his body. And I'm the one who's going to kill him." There was a long silence. The crowd had almost fully dispersed. It was Ron who spoke first.
"We'll be there, Harry."
"What?"
"At your aunt and uncle's house, and then we'll go with you, wherever you're going."
"No." "You said to us once before," Hermione said quietly, linking hands with them both, "that there was a time to turn back if we wanted to. We've had time, haven't we?"
"We're with you, whatever happens,"
Ron added. The end. Thank you for listening to This Feeling by LeilahMoon, read by LeilahMoon. If you would like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on YouTube, Spotify, AO3, Instagram, or Tumblr.